Well, and David, you suggested that the Emancipation statue with Abraham Lincoln should not be torn down. Explain.
Well, that monument was put up in April of 1879 on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. It was paid for $20,000 by African Americans, the first $5 given by a former slave woman named Charlotte Scott in Missouri. The model for the kneeling slave, the offensive, now quite offensive image of that kneeling slave, was a real person named Archer Alexander, who was the last person in Missouri actually prosecuted under the Fugitive Slave Act. He has a very interesting history himself. The whole unveiling event of that statue was a black affair in Washington, D.C., a huge parade. But most importantly to me, Frederick Douglass all but rendered that ground sacred with the unveiling speech that he gave at that memorial. That speech is, to me, the second greatest speech of Douglass's life after his 4th of July speech, because in that speech, he honestly, forthrightly declared that Abraham Lincoln had been the white man's president, that Abraham Lincoln had the assumptions and prejudices of white Americans. He didn't just get up and make some ceremonial speech. He bluntly stated that. And he said, "My fellow white Americans, you are Abraham Lincoln's children. I and my people are only his stepchildren, by adoption, by necessity, by circumstances." But then in the second part of the speech, classic move by Frederick Douglass in his oratory, he shifted. And he said, "However, under his rule and in due time," and he used it 3 times as a refrain, he said, "the way we became free was by this cautious, methodical method that Lincoln used federal power and used the armies to free African Americans." So on the one hand, it was this bluntly honest statement of where Lincoln had come from, but then also about where Lincoln had reached. And last point, in that speech, Douglass was telling the country, you're losing Reconstruction right now in 1876. If you don't act fast, you will lose all the great results of the Civil War. I prefer that we build a new Emancipation Memorial next to that monument. Let's get some modern artists inspired by this story. Let's build an Emancipation Memorial next to it, which is actually what Frederick Douglass advocated about 5 days after he gave that unveiling speech.
That speech by Frederick Douglass, one of the most extraordinary in American history. I in fact, have it pinned on my Twitter feed because it lines up with, if you read Carl Sandburg's biography of Abraham Lincoln, he was considered maddeningly cautious by abolitionists. He was considered maddeningly pragmatic. In fact, Lincoln said at the beginning, wrote a letter to the nation saying, if my goal is to save the Union, if that means it's a Union that is half free and half slave, that is my goal. If that means it is completely free, then that is my goal. I put saving the Union above everything else. But as you read Sandburg's book, you understand that Lincoln is just trying to drag, not the South, he's fighting the South, the North along in this project to free the slaves. And that Douglass speech, excuse me for going on here, it is one of the most remarkable speeches I've ever heard in explaining Abraham Lincoln and the mission of Abraham Lincoln. Kimberly, Donald Trump would like us to believe that if Wilson's name is taken off of Princeton, or if the founder of the Ku Klux Klan statue is taken down, they're coming after the Jefferson Memorial and the Washington Monument next. What is the response to that? What should the response to that be?
Well, the messaging by the president is serving a specific purpose. It is a call to the specific part of America that he believes is supportive of him, that he believes he needs to galvanize in order to win politically. The president is not speaking as a historian. He's not speaking about the values of America as an institution. He's speaking to the people who are important to him in that sense. And I think that's a very different different discussion than the one that we are having here. I can speak for myself as a Black American, knowing that many of these monuments were put up for the purpose of terrorism, for the purpose of terrorizing Black Americans long after the Civil War was done, speaks volumes about what they enshrine and what they mean. But I would love to ask Eddie a question as we stand now in what at some point will be called the civil rights era of the 2020s, and how that will be memorialized. How should America think of that moving forward? How do we memorialize this moment? What monuments should be made to this moment? And how do you deal with the fact that we live in a country where our presidents, where monuments are made to our president? So what will the monument to the 45th president of the United States look like? What should it look like?
I'm not sure, Kimberly, to be honest with you. As David Blight, the historian, will say, he would have to wait and see. We have a choice in front of us. It is a momentous choice, whether or not we're going to double down on our ugliness or whether or not we're going to imagine a new America. And I was just thinking about that speech by Frederick Douglass, Kimberly, and Joe, and David, and Willie, and Mika. I was thinking about that speech and drawing a straight line to Jimmy Baldwin. There's a line that Jimmy uses where he says, people who imagine that history flatters them are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin. We have to deal with the ugliness of who we are and what we've done in order to imagine ourselves otherwise. That's what it means to be creatures of history. That's what it means to carry history with us forward into the present, and as we try desperately to imagine a better future.
Eddie, that's well said. I was going to ask you to bring Mr. Baldwin back into the conversation around your book here, and just speak specifically about the monument question. You started to do it right there. He was insistent that white Americans have told themselves a version of history that puts them at the center of it, of course, and as you quoted there, flatters them. What does taking down a Confederate statue, what does challenging some of the stories of history that we've heard, what does that do for our new look at history, the way perhaps James Baldwin would want us to look at it?
Well, I think the first thing, Willie, that's such a great question. The first thing it does, right, it is an explicit attempt to address the lie. The lost cause is a lie. Those statues are memorials to that lie. And outside of the fact that it actually happened in history, but the story that it tries to commend, the values that those statues represent, right, are values that run contrary to a robust understanding or a robust view of multiracial democracy. So what Baldwin constantly asked of us, and what I'm asking of us in this moment, is that we confront our history. We confront the stories that we've told of ourselves so that we can actually free ourselves into imagining America differently and to imagine our relationship to each other differently. And I think that's what Baldwin meant when he says the great force of history is that we carry it forward in ourselves. And it's with great pain and terror that we confront ourselves, which means we confront that history. So I understand what Ross is talking about, what he's writing about. I understand the anxiety that some folk are having as we struggle with the meaning of Jefferson and Washington and the meaning of these monuments. But I do know this, that if we don't struggle, we will be permanently docked at the station. We will not change. And then the monuments that Kim asked about will be monuments to ruins. Not to a better America.
Mike Barnicle has a question for David. Mike.
David, listening to this conversation this morning, this is what we do best, not just on this show, but television. This is what we do best. We don't do it often enough, but it is really rewarding and enriching to listen to what's been going on here for the past several minutes. My question to you is, history was my favorite course in high school. I loved history. I still love history. But history is literally a study of the past. And as we discuss what we're discussing today, with all these kernels of information dropped out that many people have not heard of before, is it not an indictment of the way we have been teaching history to our children, the omission of all of these vital facts about who we really are today?
Well, Mike, thank you for that question. I'm afraid the answer is yes and no. Historians for 3 generations have rewritten the history of this country, especially the history of slavery, race, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, civil rights. But there is always a great distance between the scholarly history we write in the academy, even those of us who write for larger audiences, and the public memory. The task is to affect that public memory. And I would have, and by the way, a shout out to Eddie's book. Get the book, folks. Take a walk with Eddie, with James Baldwin. It will be rewarding. Now, last point. I love the fact that you all used those clips of Vice President Biden's speech yesterday, because one of the best things the Biden campaign could do right now, I would think it'd be very popular, is to announce that they are going to get behind this, not just taking down Confederate monuments and having to, cut that fine line between which slaveholder we take away and which slaveholder we don't. But why not get behind the issue or the idea of building emancipation memorials? Let's replace that Confederate landscape, and let's replace it with serious, interesting, historically informed emancipation memorials. Start with one in Lincoln Park in Washington, and then have a commission that allows localities to do the same. Let's put a monument in every place that had a refugee camp for escaped slaves. And then let's move on to what was just suggested about this moment. How will we begin to think about commemorating this moment? We need a lot more time to do that. But the Biden administration should get behind that.
Professor
I'm sorry,
David
Biden
Blight of
campaign.
Yale University, thank you for your time this morning. And we will continue our conversation around Eddie's excellent new book tomorrow. Eddie, stay with us. Eddie's book is Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. We want to.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.